You'll see on most commentators in the media constantly urging the U.S. to become more engaged in the negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians.
Today that the U.S. must get more involved in settling the conflict.
There are growing calls for President Bush to take on a more active role.
Nearly everyone agrees the U.S. must play a more active role in an attempt to...
The premise of that view is the idea that's stated over and over again, that the U.S. is merely trying to bring about a peace, trying to bring the two sides together. It has no preconceptions about what, whose side is right and whose side is wrong, which side needs to make more compromises and which doesn't. And I think that's a fundamentally inaccurate view of how U.S. diplomacy has worked over the past several years.
The United States has presented itself as a neutral broker between these two parties. But if you look at its actions rather than its words, you see that it has favored Israel almost 100% of the time. The U.S. has vetoed resolutions many times that would have put a stop to Israel's actions in the territory.
In New York, a push by the Palestinians and their supporters to win a UN Security Council resolution calling for an end to the violence was vetoed by the United States.
Israel has rejected UN involvement in the conflict, backed by its closest ally, the United States.
The U.S. blocked diplomatic moves from the Arab states, from Europe, from the PLO, anything, because it just refused to accept this kind of diplomatic settlement. Well, there's a name for that in the United States. It's called the peace process. What it actually is the process by which the United States prevented peace.
The United States has struggled for decades with widely varying success and failure to help ease this Mideast conflict.
The United States as a neutral broker between Israel and the Palestinians is a cruel joke on both Palestinians and the Arab world at large. The United States has exercised its veto many, many times in the Security Council, but perhaps worse than that is that it provides billions of dollars of aid to Israel, a lot of it military aid, and a lot of it in the most lethal possible form.
American aid to Israel totals over $6 billion per year. Israel receives $3 billion in direct aid, 2/3 of which is military aid intended for the purchase of American-made weapons. In addition, Israel receives $3 billion in indirect aid, at least half of which is used for military ventures, such as subsidizing Israel's domestic armaments industry. Not included in this figure are other forms of military aid, such as weapons given to Israel free of charge, including fighter planes and attack helicopters. Total U.S. aid to Israel since 1949 has amounted to over $100 billion, making Israel, a country the size of New Jersey, the fourth most powerful military in the world, in possession of the largest fleet of F-16 fighter planes outside the United States.
The international community says that better not mean more of this, the devastation caused by Israel's F-16s. So Israel's tanks, missiles and helicopter gunships are no longer enough. Now Ariel Sharon has used fighter planes. America supplied the planes, seen here in action in Lebanon.
The pipeline of violence is very much stamped made in USA. I mean, the United States has been brokering an alleged peace process for how long, and what does the situation look like? I mean, if peace were the genuine goal, it would be such a catastrophic failure that, it would have ended a long time ago. Clearly, in the name of peace, other things are going on here.
Control over Middle East oil will provide us with veto power over Japan and other countries. They rely on Middle East oil. If we have our hand on the lever, we have veto power over what they do. These are techniques of world control and the source of enormous profit and wealth, not just for the energy corporations.
The United States, at least the Bush administration and its strategists, have recognized that the EU and possibly Russia are potential competitors. And so being able to keep control of trade, investment, and the oil industry in a region that is very close to Russia, very close to Europe, this is a way for the United States to maintain its hegemony.
There's a framework of state policy, it's been in place for about 30 years, of supporting Israel as a kind of base for projection of U.S. power in the region.
That support intensified under Clinton and intensified even more in the Bush administration with the rise to power of the neoconservatives in the Defense Department, such as Paul Wolfowitz, Douglas Feith, Donald Rumsfeld, and others like them.
Now, when in effect you have people so close to Israel inside the US administration, I think Israel is in the White House.
This was the 6th meeting between Mr. Bush and Prime Minister Sharon.
Every time he comes, I learn a lot.
The president has never...
There is no difference any longer between US policy in the Middle East and Israeli policy.
All of us here tonight are brought together by a deep commitment to Israel's security, prosperity, and freedom, and to the strongest possible relationship between Israel and the United States.
The U.S. wants to make sure that Israel can control the situation by violence, as it does, of course, and it'll give the diplomatic cover, it'll give them the military means.
Congress, which is very, very strongly pro-Israeli at the moment, 94 votes to 2 was the way a resolution was passed in the Senate the other day, wholeheartedly endorsing everything Israel is doing.
At no point, however, has the mainstream media, whether television or newspapers, confronted and challenged this issue in your country, in the United States.
To find critical views on American diplomacy, you really have to go beyond the mainstream media. You can find very critical views in the British press. You can even find critical views in the Israeli press. But whereas there will be some criticisms at the margins of details of how America conducts its diplomacy in the Middle East, you don't find a real alternative viewpoint in the mainstream media.
It is the last taboo subject in America. You can talk about lesbians, blacks, gays, anything you want, but not America's relationship, or not any serious examination of America's relationship with Israel, or what Israel is doing, albeit almost always with American weapons.
U.S. journalists are enmeshed in symbiotic relationships with the powerful. Instead of being independent and critical, journalists typically are dependent on policymakers and unwilling to raise the crucial critical questions. Rather than monitoring the game of power, most journalists are simply part of that game.
You only have to see the press conferences, Condoleezza Rice, George Bush, Donald Rumsfeld. It's all on first name.
And with that, I'm happy to take your questions. Helen?
Yeah, April?
David?
Yes, Randy.
John?
What do you know about the sourcing of the British...
But the relationship between American journalists, particularly television journalists, and the centers of power has become incestuous. So close, because an argument could cut you off from access to the center of power, so close that it is impossible any longer to convey what you know about the centers of power. All you can do is say what you think they mean and what you know they say. So what's the point of journalism?